Everybody, this is John with another installment of Think Culture. I wanted to just pop in, it's been a while, and talk a little bit about social order. I think it's important to understand. I think it's foundational to our attempts to understand and interact with things in politics. And it's not well enough understood. So I thought I could provide a kind of simple explanation for social order to serve as a kind of foundation for thinking about things going on in politics, in the public sphere generally, in culture. Prohibitions define the character of a culture, the character of a social order, the character of a people. You don't have a society without prohibitions, right? Prohibitions are constitutive of the society. And this is, it should be well understood. It's been talked about, it's been thematized. Civilization and its discontents, for example. Freud talks about how repression buys you civilization. You have to have repression in order to have civilization. He thinks it's worth the cost. I would happen to agree with him. But that is the nature of things. Without controls, behavioral controls, normative constraints, on human behavior, you don't have a culture, right? It levels all of the choices into just choices between what I would rather pursue right now or not, based on a whim, a desire for sort of momentary pleasure. We all have that. We all have those instincts. If you look at, for example, Plato's Republic, right? There's this analogy of the soul and the city of man. It's an important one. There's a ton to say about it, but I think that they're analogous too. So, for example, in an individual soul, Plato will talk about how if you indulge the appetitive part of your soul, the appetitive part of your soul grows, right? He has this kind of portrait of a chimera. The soul is a chimera consisting of three different parts. And he's basically like, if you feed the beast of your appetitive nature, the appetites grow. You don't sate them, right? You don't quell them. And we notice that, like, when you're trying to get into a good habit or to get out of a bad habit or something like that, the nature of addiction, it all works sort of the same. You say, like, oh, well, I'm quitting smoking just this one time, it's like a special event or something, just this one time. You do it, and that doesn't somehow, satisfy this longing that you have to smoke within you, and then you get back to life. It increases it, and it weakens your capacity to fight against it in the future, right? To fight against this push toward appetitive satisfaction. And so I think basically human nature is such that there's constantly this internal push toward appetitive satisfaction. And there have to be parts of your soul that are united. For Plato, like the spirited part is supposed to help the rational part. But the point is that there has to be a part of your soul which constrains. If it doesn't constrain, you just become a beast, right? He says the beast eats the man in you. And I think that's clearly, obviously true. And I think it's true at the level of societies too. There's constantly every time you have a society which is defined by its prohibitions, right? It's defined by its controls. You constantly have internal to that society a push from members, from groups, whatever, which is exactly analogous to that, a kind of push toward appetitive satisfaction, which would mean a push toward diminishing the controls. Okay, as soon as you give in to this push toward the diminishing of controls, the power of the controlling infrastructure of your society is reduced. So next time there's a push, it's reduced further. Next time there's a push, it's reduced further, right? And the longing for this kind of craven satisfaction progressively increases. I think that's what progressivism is. So it's a good word choice there. But I think that's the way societies work. That's why there's a kind of slippery slope as an iron law of historical development, right? You have a society, and this is, again, look at Plato's Republic, right? He thinks that even if you achieved this kind of perfect city, if you want to think about it that way, it can't last. I think that basically he's saying it's impossible anyway. Maybe we shouldn't even desire it. But in terms of his understanding of historical development and different types of regimes, right? He says, even if you could have this kind of ideal type of regime in terms of perfect justice, right, it wouldn't last. It would inevitably degenerate into worse and worse types of regimes. And I think that's just a natural progression historically, right? And that's why it happens. In, like if you read Spengler and stuff like that, it happens too. That's because there's constantly this push, and you only have to fail one time, right? If you're trying to start a diet, you've been on a diet, a day or two or whatever, and you're like, oh man, but I really want some cake or something. When you eat the cake, all that does is sort of dramatically increase the odds that you're not going to follow through with the diet. Right? It isn't a kind of like, I have this intensity built up within me, I release it, and then I'm good to go, right? Actually, your work, like now you're going to crave it more than you did before, and you already weren't strong enough to resist it before. That's how the nature of these controlling mechanisms within society work. Okay, at the individual level, we're constantly at war with ourselves, struggling to control our baser desires and instincts. At the societal level, too, right, there are baser desires and instincts represented in the social body, and there's a constant war within the social body to control them, right? And as soon as they're indulged, the controls weaken. And there's no going back. Like there's this saying I always like talking about from Robert Harrison in Entitled Opinions. And at one point he talked about how the square is intelligible from the perspective of the cube, but not vice versa. And what he's talking about is you can pass a light through a cube and it'll project a square onto the wall. But there's no way of getting back from the square to the cube. This is the way I understand the problem that we're talking about now. It's the way I understand like Western neoliberal globalization, the McDonaldization of the world, right? Once you have already relaxed all these controls and your society and your souls have become more anarchic, it's difficult to understand why to want to choose to go back to a repressive regime, right? And remember in Freud, for example, he talks about how you buy civilizations with your repression. Right? But it's hard to want to be repressed, right? It's hard to want those controls to be, and even harder still to be able to achieve them despite wanting them. Okay, so once you have a society that's already had all of these controls liquidated, the people in that society essentially cannot go back, right? They once you're already able to indulge your sexual instincts, once you're already able to indulge yourself in terms of drugs, etc., and so forth, it's hard to want to be like, oh, I actually want to not be able to indulge myself, right? It's much easier if you're in a society where these controls are functioning to defend them and prevent them from weakening, to always police these kind of normative boundaries, right? And early on in social development, the normative boundaries are very strong. In American society and increasingly globally, to a large extent already globally, these norms have been weakened. That's like sort of what capital does, right? As Marx says, like all that is solid melts into air, right? That's the point. That's the normative boundaries get dissolved by capital as things become increasingly commodified, as markets are increasingly proliferating. The controls prevent market activity, basically. So I tend to think about it like that. But the point here is, it's a deadly game for a society, and you can't go back up. And it works like a slippery slope historically because you have to resist the pressure to relax the control. You have to resist the desire for release every single time. And as soon as you fail once, you're going to fail twice, you're going to fail a third time, you're going to fail again, right? So you can notice that all social movements work like, art works like this, right? Initially, like you could say with the Renaissance or something, you have a kind of high degree of technical proficiency. People work for hundreds of hours on their works. They're beautiful and profound. And with every sort of generation, you get like, oh, I want to be transgressive. I want to push boundaries. I want to subvert the traditional boundaries. They do that, right? And some of it gets tolerated, especially in art, right? Because artists are sort of by nature more essentially transgressive or necessarily transgressive. And so there's some slight subversion, right? Now we're relaxing the realism. Now we're actually like, we have cubism. Now we don't have cubism, we just draw a freaking cube. Now we just put a urinal in an art gallery. Now we just shit in a bottle. And once you're all the way there, now, like, even if an artist wants to regain the kind of normative controls on aesthetics that we used to have and define, create works that would be defined by this previous set of aesthetic rules, right? It's kitsch. It's like perceived as silly, It doesn't work the same. They can't. Someone sculpting the Pieta today, it would just be lame. It's an anachronism, like a goofy anachronism. You see that sort of thing with everything, right? You see it with policing. Once you start getting this like intense scrutinizing of police behavior, Rodney King and stuff like that, right? Then now the controlling apparatus is weakened a little bit. Then you're like, okay, we have to have body cams. Then you're like, okay, no more broken windows policing, no more stop and search. Now we have abolished the police, right? That's the necessary trajectory of all social development if you don't heavily police the boundaries, these normative boundaries. You have to ensure that they don't crumble, or else that's what happens. And you can see this in the language of the left. They're constantly talking about destigmatizing, normalize this, normalize that, depathologize this, right? And again, that's the kind of trajectory. They're talking about it explicitly because that's how it works, right? Something is illegal, then you start to accept it, right? Or you start tolerating it in some individual members of society because this pressure is constantly coming toward release from the normative controls, right? So eventually it weakens a little bit. Once it weakens a little bit, then you like tolerate some of it, but it's behind closed doors. Then you're like, oh, you need to accept us publicly. Like, we shouldn't have to do it in secret. You should tolerate us like that. Then it's, okay, we're going to make it illegal. Let's think about gay marriage, for example, or just being gay, right? It used to be confined to private secrecy, right? Then it's like, okay, we know we're going to admit that it exists, and we're going to sort of tolerate it. Socially, it's weird, but whatever. Like maybe it's a little bit stigmatized, but it's not. Or maybe, it's illegal, then it's a taboo, then it's stigmatized. And then it's like, okay, well, it's just tolerated. Then once it's just sort of tolerated, then it's legal. Then it becomes accepted. Then it becomes promoted. Then it becomes the norm, the new norm. The new norm is this kind of disinhibition, right? The new norm is sexual anarchy. You see the same thing with divorce. You see the same thing with drugs. You see the same thing with everything, because that's the way that social order works in general, right? Because that's how the human soul works. And so that's how the polis works. That's how the political bodies work, how social bodies work. When you start feeding the appetitive part, it devours everything else, right? If you're weakening the collective superego, guess what that means? The release of the id, right? The id becomes increasingly powerful. Eventually, it's everything, right? Eventually, it's, we don't have drag shows that are like a weird sex thing for adults that are sort of like hidden or whatever. Eventually you go down. Okay, now we have like genderqueer literature for kindergartners in schools, and we're doing drag queen story hour, and et cetera, right? If you don't rigorously, viciously protect these normative boundaries, protect the controls that define the society, you lose society. You just lose the whole thing. And societies that are disinhibited are all the same, right? They lack character, specificity, particularity. They become squares that are unable to understand cubes, that are unable to want to go back to a cube. They would say, why would I choose to live in to just live in a world, like I already am free to do whatever I want now. Why would I choose to make myself less free? That doesn't make any sense at all. What's very difficult to understand there is that the norms enable the same way that they disable. They enable by disabling, right? Societies develop their specificities through restriction, through prohibition. When everything is prohibited, or when everything is unprohibited, when everything is allowed, when you can do everything you want, when you have total freedom, we're all just animals. We're all exactly the same as animals, right? It's just the bestialization of human beings in general. Then we're not talking about politics anymore. We're talking about zoology, right? It's just we have these instincts. Maybe there's a relationship between biology and instincts, and people just seek the gratification of their instincts, and we should accept it. That's who they are, right? And then everyone's the same. Everyone is a drug-addicted, sex-craven narcissist, like narcissistic lunatic who just does whatever they want all the time. They don't care about what anyone else says or what anyone else does, right? Because everything has been gone from prohibition to taboo to stigmatization to acceptance to normalization, right? To normative. Yeah. And so you have to prevent that. If you want to prevent, personally, the question of whether or not it's possible to reconstitute society or something like that, I'm pretty dubious about. But insofar as it's possible to either prevent sort of further decline or to regain something in some way, what that would mean is harshness, right? We've become very much about open-minded acceptance, toleration. You have to be nice. People live differently than you. You need to accept that, live and let live, blah, blah, blah. That is the rhetoric of Western suicide, right? To take sort of James Burnham's liberalism is the what does he say? The pathology of Western suicide, the syndrome of Western suicide, something like that. That is the kind of rhetoric that sort of accompanies that suicidal path for a culture. What you need to do is be harsh. You need to re-stigmatize, re-pathologize, don't accept, right? You need to bully, right? In the past, the fact of the matter simply is normative boundaries, insofar as you're not talking about the letter of the law. And the letter of the law always comes after, right? It's an after effect, which means that the work has to be done extra legally. The way the work here is done extra legally, the way norms, controls are enforced socially, is through bullying, right? It's through stigmatization. It's through pathologization. And so those things are actually important. Like we have they've become taboo for us. That's because we've gone so far down this path, right? But bullying is actually really good, really important. Stigmatization is really important. Taboos are really important. When this kind of stuff, like when things that are disordered had to be confined to the private sphere, to secrecy or whatever, the reason for that wasn't so much the letter of the law. It was because if you did it, you would be disowned by your family potentially. You would lose friends. People would mock you. You might lose your job. Blah blah blah. Right? That's the way that it worked. You were mercilessly bullied. That's the way it should. That's the way it should be, right? People who engage in kind of aberrant behavior, who have kind of aberrant psychopathologies or whatever, they used to be made fun of. We used to bully people. People used to have behaviors that were stigmatized or taboos. It was like, oh, if you do that, then everyone is going to call you a freak. They're going to relentlessly call you a freak. And now it's like, oh, if you do that, you're mean. Like, niceness is just like the supreme virtue. Everyone just has to be nice. That's the only virtue that we have left. And so, for example, like the Matt Walsh thing with Dylan Mulvaney, right? Everyone was like, oh, he's being so mean. He's being really mean to Dylan Mulvaney. Why would you do that? But it's like, if you're not mean, how are you policing the norms? How are you policing the controls? They have to be policed. Otherwise, you lose the character of your society altogether. And every society, one by one, in the era of sort of neoliberal globalization, is having the same thing happen to them, right? They're all eventually going to be like stuck at home playing video games, doing drugs, masturbating. I mean, you hear this, like, it has a lot to do with sexual relations and stuff too, but you hear this from people like, who was that, Chelsea Handler? She had that video. It was like supposed to be a joke, and she's like, it's so great not having kids. Why? Because I like roll out of bed late, and then I masturbate for a while, and then I get high, and then I indulge myself on some some food that's bad for me. I just eat a lot of like potato chips and candy or something, and then I like smoke weed again, masturbate again, go to bed whenever I want. And it's like, oh, this like idyllic world that you've created for yourself, since you don't have the kind of restraints that are impressed upon you by having kids. That is seen as the ideal increasingly. And that's going to become increasingly the way that societies actually look. The way that, like, that's going to be the normal form of human behavior. Because when you de-repress, right, and now there's a term for this also that comes from the Frankfurt School, interestingly, so again, you should be reading them, repressive desublimation, right? When you desublimate, when you take, like, so for example, in Freud, you have this libidinal drive, right? In order for you to be able to live in a political community, you have to endure repression. That is to say, you have to say, I have these drives, but I can't act on them because they're taboos or something like that, right? And so the libidinal energy that's moving that direction has to be sort of rerouted to a socially acceptable avenue. Right? That's what sublimation is. That's what in Freud things like art are a product of, right? Like Leonardo da Vinci isn't allowed to just like go frauding with the guys or whatever. So instead he has to engage in artistic invention, right? He has to become an artistic genius because he's got all this energy that's pent up and requires release somewhere else. And that's sort of how you get cultural development. That's how you get technological development. That's how you get scientific development. And so as you increasingly abolish the controls, right, human beings lose their character as human beings. Culture loses its dynamism. It loses its particularity and specificity. And people just indulge themselves, right? And life just consists in the perpetual sort of self-indulgence because the beast has devoured the man in terms of the soul of individuals. It devours it in the society, right? The society is there to protect not just individuals from each other, but individuals from themselves, right? It helps sort of serve as a kind of bulwark for me to restrict my appetites. Because if I don't restrict the appetitive part of my nature, it will destroy me, right? So society is always also there to protect you from you. As soon as it loses that capacity because you've whittled away at it with acceptance and destigmatization, then what happens is you lose yourself too, right? And you become a beast. And that's bad. Right. So this is like fundamentally the problem of social order, I think. I think that's a pretty easy way to explain it, kind of simple way to explain it. And I think it makes clear the stakes of everything going on. Like it serves as a kind of foundation for interpreting things that are going on. I think it's important. So hopefully you enjoyed that. Hopefully I'm back, before several months have gone by. I'm gonna try, but I always say that. So I think this is the time. This time it's real. But I mean, it's the same sort of thing. Like when I indulge, it's not laziness because I'm doing lots of other stuff. I have a family and kids and stuff, but my son just turned 1, my younger son, so that was pretty cool. He turned 1 yesterday. But let's just call it laziness. As soon as I indulge my laziness, right, I just become a more lazy person. Eventually, I'm going to be maxed out on laziness, unless I can sort of regain control of myself somehow. But anyway, hope you enjoyed that. See you next time. Don't simply react, but think culture.